Every weekday morning, Sarah Newton changed the station before her father entered the kitchen. Frank Newton preferred weather reports and farm prices. Sarah preferred music. At 17, she believed a day should begin with something louder than rainfall totals and sugarcane futures. She would turn the dial on the small plastic radio beside the bread box, lower the volume just enough to hear her mother moving down the hallway, and sing while packing her lunch. The words were rarely correct. Sarah invented whatever she could not remember and laughed when her younger brother Daniel corrected her. Frank always arrived during the second song. "Some of us need to know whether the roads are flooding," he would say. "Some of us need a reason to use the roads at all," Sarah would answer. Then she would slide the radio back toward him, take one piece of toast, and leave before he could remind her that breakfast required more than coffee. On the mornings Sarah disappeared, the radio remained on Frank's station. Her mother, Evelyn, noticed that first. Sarah's lunch bag was gone. Her bedroom was neat enough to suggest she had expected to return. A blue sweater lay across the bed, and the book she was reading remained open near the lamp. One shoe was beneath the chair. The other was missing, because Sarah had been wearing it when she left for the St. Alder Parish Fair the previous afternoon. By 10 o'clock that night, her family knew she had not come home. By midnight, Frank had driven every road between the fairgrounds and the Newton house. Before sunrise, Daniel stood in the kitchen listening to adults discuss riverbanks, ditches, boyfriends, strangers, and police jurisdiction. No one turned on the radio. For 41 years, the space beside the bread box remained the place Daniel remembered most clearly, not because anything happened there, but because something stopped happening. His sister never changed the station again. St. Alder was a small community west of Baton Rouge, surrounded by sugarcane fields, drainage canals, and low roads that disappeared beneath water during heavy storms. The town had one high school, two churches large enough to host parish events, a courthouse built before the Second World War, and a main street where most businesses closed before dark. People knew one another through family names. The Newtons had lived in the parish for 3 generations. Frank worked as an electrician at the Belrose sugar mill. Evelyn prepared meals at St. Alder Elementary School. Their home stood on a narrow lot near Bayou Marais, with pecan trees in the backyard and a shallow drainage ditch beside the road. Sarah was born in 1962. She was the oldest child and the first person in the family who intended to attend college away from home. She had recently been accepted into a practical nursing program in Lafayette and planned to begin the following January. The decision caused tension with Frank. He was proud of her, but the cost frightened him. The mill had reduced hours, and the family had little savings. Sarah believed she could work while studying. Frank believed she underestimated how difficult that would be. Evelyn quietly supported her. Sarah had spent 2 years volunteering at a small clinic operated by St. Bernadette Parish. She cleaned examination rooms, organized supplies, and sat with elderly patients who had no family nearby. Dr. Leonard Avery, who owned the town pharmacy and supervised the clinic, said Sarah possessed an unusual kind of patience. She was not calm because nothing bothered her. She was calm because she noticed when fear made other people feel embarrassed. Sarah also worked at Avery's pharmacy on Friday evenings and Saturdays. She filled shelves, delivered prescriptions to older residents, and used part of her pay to purchase nursing textbooks. She was fair-skinned, with long, dark blonde hair and green eyes. A thin scar crossed the inside of her left wrist, the result of falling through a greenhouse window when she was 9. Sarah wore a silver ring from her grandmother and a small wooden cross Daniel had carved during a school project. She was not known for impulsive behavior. That would matter when officers began suggesting she had run away. Daniel was 12 when Sarah vanished. He followed her everywhere and denied doing it. Sarah taught him how to drive Frank's truck across the back field, though he could barely reach the pedals. She helped him build a model airplane and pretended not to notice when he took money from her dresser to buy comic books. Their arguments were loud and brief. On the afternoon of the parish fair, Daniel asked if he could accompany her. Sarah refused. She was meeting friends and helping at the St. Bernadette Clinic booth. Daniel accused her of acting important because she was leaving for college. Sarah told him she would bring him a caramel apple. Those were the last words she spoke to him. The caramel apple became one of the details Daniel repeated to investigators until adults stopped writing it down. He believed promises were evidence. Police believed they were ordinary words exchanged between siblings. Both were right. Sarah had been dating Paul Fontenot for nearly a year. Paul was 18, worked at his uncle's repair shop, and planned to remain in St. Alder. He was quiet, broad-shouldered, and uncomfortable around Sarah's more ambitious friends. Their relationship was affectionate but strained by her decision to study in Lafayette. Paul wanted to marry young. Sarah wanted to wait. 2 weeks before the fair, they argued in the pharmacy parking lot. A customer heard Paul say that Sarah would forget him the moment she met someone at college. Sarah replied that she could not spend her life proving she would not leave. Paul punched the side of his truck after she walked away. He later admitted the argument to police. That honesty did not help him. On the day Sarah disappeared, Paul attended the fair with 2 friends. Witnesses saw him speaking with Sarah near the livestock pavilion at approximately 6:30 in the evening. The conversation appeared tense. Paul said Sarah ended the relationship. Her friend Melanie Rhodes remembered Sarah saying only that she needed space until January. The difference seemed small. It became central after she vanished. Paul left the fair shortly before 8. A gas station clerk saw him purchasing fuel at 8:45, 12 miles north of town. Sarah was last seen sometime between 8 and 9. Paul's movements did not completely eliminate him. They gave investigators enough uncertainty to keep returning. The St. Alder Parish Fair occupied a field beside the old racetrack. There were carnival rides, food stands, livestock competitions, church booths, and a temporary stage for local bands. In 1979, the fair contracted with Gulf States Amusements, a traveling company that operated rides throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and eastern Texas. Sarah arrived shortly after 2 in the afternoon. She helped at the clinic booth, took blood pressure readings, and distributed information about heat exhaustion. Later, she met Melanie and 2 classmates near the Ferris wheel. Several photographs were taken that day. In one, Sarah stood beneath a banner, wearing jeans, a white blouse, and the blue sweater later found on her bed. She had removed it because of the heat and returned it to Frank's truck when he briefly visited the fair. Another photograph showed Sarah speaking to a man near a maintenance trailer. The image was not developed until after she disappeared. The man's face was partly turned away. He wore a gray work shirt and held a camera by its strap. His name was Silas Mercer. At the time, no one realized he had already spoken with Sarah twice. Silas Mercer was 34 and worked as a refrigeration and electrical mechanic for Gulf States Amusements. He repaired food coolers, lighting systems, and generators. He also took informal photographs of workers and visitors, selling prints at some fairs. Silas traveled in a red and white Ford pickup with a camper shell. His employment records listed an address in Arkansas, but the property belonged to his sister, Marlene Mercer. He had used other names in previous jobs. In Texas, he called himself Alan Marsh. In Oklahoma, he used the name Samuel Crane. Silas had been questioned in connection with the disappearance of a 14-year-old girl in 1974, but no charges were filed. The girl returned home after 2 days and refused to describe what happened. That report remained in another state under another name. Louisiana investigators did not find it in 1979. Sarah first encountered Silas at Avery's pharmacy when he purchased bandages for a hand injury. He told her he had been burned repairing a generator. Sarah cleaned the wound after Dr. Avery saw that it needed attention. Silas asked whether she was a nurse. She said not yet. He returned the following week to thank her and learned she would be working at the parish fair. Sarah mentioned the encounters to Melanie, but did not consider them important. Silas appeared helpful, polite, and older than the men she knew. He did not flirt openly. He listened. That made him difficult to remember as a threat. At approximately 8:20 on the night of September 15th, rain began falling over the fairgrounds. The storm was brief but heavy. Families crowded beneath tents, rides stopped, and the public address system became difficult to hear. Sarah helped move clinic supplies into boxes. A carnival worker later remembered seeing Silas near the booth. He told Sarah that a woman had been injured behind the maintenance trailers. According to the worker, Sarah followed him because she believed medical help was needed. The witness did not report the conversation immediately. He assumed Sarah returned. At 8:37, the fair lost power in the southern section. The outage lasted 6 minutes. During that time, the rear service gate stood open to allow a generator truck to enter. Several vehicles moved through the area without being recorded. When the lights returned, Silas's red and white pickup was gone. At 9:15, Melanie searched for Sarah near the clinic booth. Her purse remained beneath the table. Inside were $11, her house key, lipstick, and a folded copy of the nursing program acceptance letter. Her silver ring was missing because she was wearing it. The wooden cross Daniel made was also gone. No one immediately connected the abandoned purse to danger. Sarah sometimes asked friends to watch her belongings. By 10, the fair was closing. Melanie called the Newton house. Sarah had not returned. Frank arrived at the fair with Daniel in the passenger seat. Evelyn remained home in case Sarah called. Fair employees searched restrooms, trailers, and parked vehicles. The sheriff's department sent 2 deputies. Deputy Curtis Dale questioned Paul Fontenot before speaking to most carnival workers. Paul admitted the argument. He said Sarah wanted to leave him and go to college without obligations. Deputy Dale wrote that Sarah may have departed voluntarily after an emotional dispute. Frank rejected the idea. Sarah's purse remained at the fair. Her money and key were inside. She had no suitcase, car, or planned destination. Deputy Dale suggested she could have left with a friend. Frank asked which friend would allow her to abandon the family. No one answered. Around 1 in the morning, a search began along the drainage canal behind the racetrack. Volunteers carried flashlights through wet grass. Daniel found one of Sarah's earrings near the service gate. It was a small brass hoop. The clasp was broken. Deputy Dale placed it in an envelope but later described it as possible costume jewelry of unknown ownership. Evelyn identified it immediately. Sarah wore the pair every week. The other earring was never found. At 4 a.m, Frank returned home to check whether Sarah had called. The kitchen radio remained silent. Sheriff Roland Broussard assumed responsibility for the case the following day. He was experienced with property crime, domestic disputes, and accidents on the bayou. He had never managed a large missing person investigation involving a traveling carnival. Broussard considered 3 possibilities. Sarah had left voluntarily. Paul had harmed her. Or a stranger had taken her during the confusion created by the storm and power failure. The first theory received more attention than the evidence justified. Sarah had argued with Paul, planned to leave for college, and experienced financial conflict with her father. Those facts were presented as signs of instability. Her nursing acceptance letter remained in her purse, which investigators interpreted in opposite ways. Frank believed it proved she intended to stay and attend school. Deputy Dale believed abandoning it could represent a rejection of her planned life. No note was found. No money disappeared from Sarah's savings account. No friend reported helping her leave. Silas appeared under the name Alan Marsh because that was the name on his seasonal paperwork. A deputy attempted to contact him at an Arkansas address. The letter was returned. No one compared the photograph from the fair with the employee records. The red and white pickup was mentioned in 2 witness statements. It was not entered into a statewide bulletin. Within 48 hours, Gulf States Amusements packed its rides and traveled to Mississippi. Silas went with them. Sarah's family did not yet know his real name. For 6 days, St. Alder organized itself around Sarah's absence. The volunteer fire department searched drainage canals. Hunters walked the tree line near Bayou Marais. Mill employees used flat-bottomed boats to examine banks that could not be reached from the road. Evelyn remained at the Newton house beside the telephone. Friends brought food that no one ate. Women from church answered calls and wrote possible sightings on index cards. Frank taped a photograph of Sarah to the front window, so reporters would not ask him to hold one each time they arrived. Daniel joined search parties until Sheriff Broussard ordered him to remain home. He ignored the instruction twice. On the 3rd day, a volunteer found a white blouse caught on a branch near a canal. Evelyn said it was not Sarah's. A shoe discovered beside the highway belonged to a woman who had lost it while changing a tire. Search dogs followed Sarah's scent, from the clinic booth toward the rear service gate. Rain had damaged the trail. Near the gate, the dogs moved toward the gravel road and then lost direction where vehicles had passed. The results supported abduction, but it was not treated as proof. Broussard requested assistance from state police. The request was classified as non-urgent because Sarah was 17, physically healthy, and possibly a runaway. That classification affected every hour that followed. Bus terminals were notified late. Border agencies received only a typed description. The carnival company was not ordered to stop traveling, and no officer searched its convoy before it crossed into Mississippi. By the time an investigator visited the next fair location, several seasonal workers had already left. Alan Marsh was among them. The investigator was told he had quit after an argument over wages. No one knew where he went. Melanie Rhodes developed her fair photographs a week after Sarah disappeared. In the background of one picture, Sarah stood beside a maintenance trailer, speaking with the man in the gray shirt. Melanie brought the photograph to the sheriff's office, remembered Sarah mentioning a mechanic from the pharmacy, but she did not know his name. Deputy Dale compared the image with employee identification cards provided by Gulf States Amusements. Several cards contained poor black and white photographs. The card for Alan Marsh had no photograph at all. Dale placed Melanie's picture inside the case file and wrote, "Unknown carnival employee. Identity pending." The identity remained pending for decades. Frank made copies and showed them at truck stops, repair shops, and fairs across southern Louisiana. Most people focused on Sarah. Few noticed the man partly hidden behind her. One carnival worker told Frank he recognized the mechanic as Silas. Frank reported the name. Sheriff Broussard searched local records and found no Silas connected to Gulf States Amusements. The employee list said Alan Marsh. The difference was treated as unreliable witness. No national database, connected aliases, seasonal employment, and missing person reports in 1979. A name that should have opened the investigation became another loose paper inside a growing file. Paul Fontenot became the easiest person to investigate. He was local, emotionally connected to Sarah, and had publicly argued with her. Unlike a traveling employee with uncertain paperwork, Paul could be found every morning at his uncle's garage. Deputies searched his truck and bedroom. They found a letter Sarah had written 2 months earlier. In it, she said she loved Paul, but refused to promise marriage before nursing school. Prosecutors later described the letter as evidence of conflict. Evelyn described it as evidence that Sarah expected a future. A small stain on Paul's truck seat tested positive for blood. The type was O positive, the same as Sarah's. Paul also had O positive blood. He explained that he cut his hand while repairing a transmission. His uncle confirmed the injury. The result proved nothing. But rumors spread faster than laboratory cautions. Someone painted the word killer across the garage door. Paul's mother stopped attending church because people stared at her. Paul agreed to a polygraph examination. The examiner reported deceptive responses when he was asked whether he knew where Sarah was. Paul later said he had reacted because he felt guilty for leaving the fair after their argument. Polygraph results were not admissible evidence, but Sheriff Broussard mentioned the test during a press conference. From that point forward, many residents considered Paul responsible. Frank did not. He disliked Paul's temper, but he could not reconcile murder with the young man who arrived at the Newton home each week, asking whether there was another place to search. Evelyn was less certain. Grief made every memory unstable. She recalled Sarah once covering a bruise near her elbow. Sarah said she struck a shelf at the pharmacy. Evelyn now wondered whether she had lied. Paul denied ever hitting her. No witness said he had. The suspicion remained because no better answer existed. 3 months after the disappearance, Evelyn received a telephone call shortly after midnight. A young woman whispered, "Mama?" Evelyn stood so quickly that the kitchen chair fell. She asked where Sarah was. The caller breathed into the line and said, "I can't come home." Then the connection ended. The call was traced to a payphone outside a bus station in Mobile, Alabama. By the time police arrived, no one remained nearby. A clerk remembered a blonde woman using the phone, but he estimated she was in her 20s. Another witness said the caller had dark hair. Frank drove to Mobile before sunrise. He carried Sarah's photograph through the terminal and showed it to travelers, drivers, janitors, and police officers. No one identified her. Investigators could not determine whether the call came from Sarah, a confused young woman, or someone who had learned details from the newspapers. Evelyn believed the voice belonged to her daughter. For years afterward, she answered every late call before the second ring. The mobile lead encouraged the runaway theory. Sarah had reached another state, some argued, and did not want to return. But the words could also support captivity. "I can't come home" did not mean "I don't want to." The distinction was not pursued. The red and white pickup seen near the service gate was registered to Marlene Mercer of Fort Smith, Arkansas. That information was available in 1979, but the license number supplied by a witness contained one incorrect digit. The search returned a farm truck in Mississippi. A corrected registration was discovered only years later. Marlene was Silas Mercer's older sister. She managed payroll and supply purchases for several carnival contractors. Unlike Silas, she maintained a stable address and used her legal name. She understood documents. She knew which county offices accepted delayed birth records, which employers asked few questions, and how seasonal workers moved without leaving complete histories. Marlene had raised Silas after their mother died. She defended him even when other relatives avoided him. In 1974, when police questioned him about the missing girl in Texas, Marlene produced timesheets that placed him at a fairground repair shop. The timesheets were false. No one charged her. After the St. Alder Fair, Silas drove to a property Marlene rented outside Nacogdoches, Texas. The land contained an old trailer, a storage shed, and several acres hidden from the road by pine trees. The property would not appear in Sarah's case file until 41 years later. Christmas decorations remained in boxes at the Newton house. Evelyn said she would put them up when Sarah returned. Daniel placed the unfinished wooden cross pattern he had used for Sarah beside her photograph. He began carving another one and stopped halfway. Frank continued searching roads on Sundays. He placed posters in towns where Gulf States Amusements had operated. The company's attorney eventually sent a letter warning him not to question employees without permission. Frank responded by mailing the attorney Sarah's photograph. The letter received no answer. The nursing school kept Sarah's place open until January. When she failed to appear, an administrator sent Evelyn a refund for part of the registration fee. Evelyn never cashed the check. Paul left St. Alder the following spring, after the garage lost customers. He joined a construction crew in Baton Rouge and returned only to speak with investigators. Daniel entered adolescence in a house where time had stopped. His parents argued about the case. Frank believed a stranger took Sarah through the service gate. Evelyn believed someone local knew more than he admitted. Both theories contained pieces of truth. Neither led to her. In 1981, a truck driver reported seeing a woman resembling Sarah at a rest area in eastern Texas. She appeared frightened and traveled with an older man, driving a pickup with a camper shell. The driver remembered the woman because she asked whether he was heading toward Louisiana. Before he could answer, the man returned and led her away by the arm. The witness did not know Sarah was missing until he saw an anniversary story 2 years later. By then, he could not remember the license plate or exact date. He described the pickup as red over white. Sheriff Broussard sent the information to Texas authorities, but the report was classified as an unconfirmed sighting. No connection was made to Marlene's vehicle registration. Frank considered it the strongest lead in the case. He traveled the highway, visited rest areas, and questioned motel owner. At one motel, a clerk remembered a couple who registered as Samuel and Ann Crane. The woman was young, quiet, and had a bandage around her left wrist. The registration card had been discarded. The clerk could not identify Sarah from the photograph with certainty. Another possibility entered the file and disappeared beneath newer pages. In 1984, hunters discovered skeletal remains in the Atchafalaya Basin. The victim was female and appeared to have been a teenager or young adult. Evelyn was asked to provide Sarah's dental records. For 6 weeks, the Newton family waited. The remains were not Sarah's. They belonged to a woman from Mississippi who had disappeared in 1982. The relief ashamed Evelyn. Another family had received the answer she feared, and she felt grateful it was not hers. That emotional contradiction repeated through the decades. Every unidentified body offered a possible ending. Every exclusion extended hope and pain at the same time. Sheriff Broussard retired in 1987. The incoming sheriff assigned Sarah's file to a cabinet containing older missing person cases. Active work occurred only when a new tip arrived. The fair photograph, broken earring, witness statements, Paul's polygraph, and returned letter to Alan Marsh remained inside cardboard folders. No evidence was preserved for DNA testing because investigators had collected no biological material clearly connected to an offender. Sarah's toothbrush and hairbrush stayed in the Newton home. At the time, no one understood how valuable they might become. Frank continued writing to state officials. He asked for the carnival employee list to be reviewed. He asked whether the man in the photograph had been identified. He asked whether the mobile caller could have been Sarah. Most replies thanked him for his concern and explained that no new evidence had emerged. Evelyn stopped attending community events because strangers asked whether she had accepted what probably happened. She did not know what acceptance meant. Accept that Sarah was dead? Accept that she had left willingly? Accept that police had lost the best chance to find her during the first 48 hours? There was no single fact to accept. There was only absence. Sarah followed Silas because he said someone had been burned by a generator. The storm had reduced visibility behind the fair. Rain struck the metal trailers loudly enough to cover voices. Silas led her beyond the temporary lights toward his pickup. Sarah asked where the injured woman was. Silas opened the camper door and said she was inside. The moment Sarah leaned toward it, he pressed a cloth across her face and pulled her backward. The chemical on the cloth did not render her unconscious instantly, as later television dramatizations suggested. It confused her, weakened her, and made coordinated resistance difficult. Sarah kicked the truck door and tore one earring loose. Silas struck her in the ribs, forced her into the camper, and secured her wrists with electrical cable. The brief power outage was not part of a sophisticated plan. Silas had caused it by disconnecting a temporary line after noticing the approaching storm. He knew the service gate would open for the generator vehicle and that employees would be distracted. He drove out with the flow of maintenance traffic. Inside the camper, Sarah remained conscious for parts of the journey. She remembered rain against the roof, the smell of gasoline, and Silas speaking through the rear window. He told her Paul had asked him to take her away. Sarah did not believe him. Then, Silas mentioned Daniel by name. He described the Newton house and the pecan trees behind it. He said that if Sarah tried to escape, Daniel would be taken next. The threat worked because it contained information a stranger should not have possessed. Silas had photographed the Newton home 2 days earlier. He had watched Sarah deliver prescriptions and learned her brother's routine. By the time they crossed into Texas, he had transformed ordinary observation into the appearance of unlimited reach. Marlene Mercer was waiting at the property outside Nacogdoches. She saw Sarah bound inside the camper. Her first words were not a question about the girl's safety. She asked Silas whether anyone had seen him leave. Sarah later remembered Marlene as the first person who made the crime feel permanent. Silas was agitated and violent. Marlene was organized. She removed Sarah's remaining jewelry, burned her shoes, and cut the labels from her clothing. The silver ring and wooden cross were placed in a metal cash box. Marlene told Sarah that police would blame Paul because Silas had seen them arguing. She said the Newton family would be watched. If Sarah cooperated, no one else would be harmed. The trailer's rear room had a plywood panel screwed over the window and a lock installed on the outside. Sarah remained there for several weeks. Silas brought food irregularly. He questioned her about her family, school, medical history, and handwriting. At first, Sarah answered nothing. He punished silence by removing the mattress or shutting off the small electric fan during the Texas heat. Marlene used a different approach. She presented herself as a protector who could control Silas if Sarah behaved. She brought clean clothes and antiseptic for the wound on Sarah's wrist. She said escape attempts would make Silas unmanageable. The manipulation depended on making Sarah believe the person assisting the abuser was the safest person available. She removed screws from the window covering with a broken spoon, climbed through the opening, and reached the tree line before Silas caught her. Afterward, he showed her photographs of Daniel leaving school. The photographs had been taken before the abduction, but Sarah did not know that. Silas said he could reach Louisiana within hours. Sarah stopped believing escape involved only her own life. Marlene began constructing a new identity. Using the birth record of a child who had died in infancy in Arkansas, she obtained a delayed certificate for Anne Louise Crane. The date of birth made Sarah 21 rather than 17. Record systems were fragmented. County offices relied on paper correspondence and notarized statements. A deceased child's identity could be revived if no agency compared the new application with death records in another jurisdiction. Marlene supplied affidavits claiming Anne had been born at home and educated privately. Silas became Samuel Crane. In 1980, they traveled through Oklahoma and New Mexico, taking seasonal repair work. Sarah was introduced as Silas's young wife. She was never left alone long enough to request help. He kept the documents, money, and vehicle keys. He monitored telephone calls and selected properties far from neighbors. When people noticed the age difference or Sarah's quiet behavior, Marlene explained that Anne had grown up in a strict religious household. Sarah learned that visible fear produced questions Silas answered later with violence. She began performing normality. She smiled when introduced. She bought groceries from lists. She called him Samuel in public. The performance protected her from immediate punishment and made eventual disclosure more difficult. Each person who saw her behaving like a wife became, in Silas's mind, a witness against her own account. He often reminded her of that. "Everyone sees what you are," he said. "Only you keep pretending it's something else." In 1981, while staying at a roadside motel near Amarillo, Sarah reached a payphone. Silas was repairing an ice machine. Marlene had left to purchase supplies. Sarah called the Newton home. The line rang 4 times before Evelyn answered. Sarah said, "Mama?" She heard her mother's voice change. For one moment, the distance between Texas and Louisiana disappeared. Then Silas stepped from the motel office. Sarah said she could not come home and ended the call. It was the midnight call traced to Mobile because Silas and Marlene drove immediately east and placed another call from Alabama, using Sarah's voice as part of a deliberate deception. Marlene had Sarah repeat the same words while Silas stood beside Daniel's photograph. The payphone trace led police away from the Texas motel. Sarah did not know investigators found the Alabama location. She believed her first call had placed the family in immediate danger. Silas reinforced that belief by disappearing for 2 days and returning with a newspaper purchased in Louisiana. The paper contained a short story about the Newton search. He said he had watched Daniel from across the street. Again, the claim may have been false. Sarah could not risk testing it. After the call, Silas broke 2 of her fingers and kept her locked inside a camper for weeks. The injuries healed without medical treatment, leaving the ring finger on her right hand permanently bent. That deformity would later help confirm her identity before DNA results were complete. Sarah became pregnant in 1984. She was 22. Silas treated the pregnancy as proof that she could no longer leave. Marlene arranged prenatal care under the name Anne Crane and attended every appointment. Sarah never spoke privately with a doctor. The baby was born in a small hospital in New Mexico. She was named Rebecca. Sarah later said motherhood changed the structure of captivity. Before Rebecca, escape meant risking Daniel and her parents. After Rebecca, escape also meant carrying an infant without documents, money, transportation, or a safe destination, while Silas pursued them. Sarah loved her daughter immediately and feared what Silas could do to her. He rarely cared for the child, but he understood her value as leverage. If Sarah resisted, he threatened to place Rebecca with Marlene and report Sarah as mentally unstable. The forged documents identified Silas as the father and Sarah as Anne Crane. Legally, Sarah feared she could not prove who she was or that Rebecca belonged with her. The couple moved frequently during Rebecca's childhood. Arizona, Nevada, Eastern Oregon, finally, Washington State. Silas worked on refrigeration systems for grocery stores and motels. Sarah cleaned rooms, did laundry, and occasionally assisted elderly residents in trailer parks. People trusted her because she was gentle and capable. Some encouraged her to become a nursing aide. Silas refused. Education, fingerprints, and background checks could expose the false identity. Sarah's original ambition survived as private knowledge. She treated Rebecca's fevers, organized medications for neighbors, and kept old anatomy books hidden beneath winter clothing. By the early 1990s, Silas no longer locked Sarah inside rooms. He did not need to. Coercive control had replaced physical confinement. He controlled the bank account, car, identification, and mail. He told neighbors Sarah suffered from anxiety and became confused under pressure. If she contradicted him publicly, the behavior appeared to confirm his explanation. Sarah knew no one in Washington who had known her before captivity. Her parents' telephone number had changed. She did not know where Daniel lived. She had no copy of her true birth certificate, and no safe explanation for decades of documents under another name. Silas also kept the metal cash box containing her ring, wooden cross, fair photographs, and newspaper articles about the search. He showed the box to her whenever she spoke about leaving. "You're dead there," he said. "And she see that, the only person who exists." A note it wrote the dairy, she sighed. "Anne is the only person who exists." Sarah did not fully believe him. She began to believe that the world would. Rebecca remembered her mother as attentive but distant. Sarah checked locks repeatedly, avoided crowds, and became ill whenever a carnival appeared nearby. She never explained why. Rebecca believed Silas was strict and emotionally cruel. She did not understand that her mother had been taken as a teenager. Children normalize the household they are given. Rebecca learned not to ask about grandparents. Silas said both sides of the family were dead. Sarah remained silent because correcting him would expose a truth she did not know how to survive. In Louisiana, Frank's health deteriorated. He developed heart problems and left the sugar mill early. Money became scarce, but he continued traveling whenever a credible sighting emerged. In 1992, a woman in Arizona reported that a motel housekeeper resembled an age-progressed image of Sarah. Frank flew for the first time in his life. The housekeeper was not his daughter. On the return trip, he experienced chest pain but refused hospitalization until he reached Louisiana. Daniel, now 25, confronted him. "You're going to die on a road looking for someone who may not want to be found," he said. Frank struck him. It was the only time he hit his son. The two men did not speak for 3 months. Daniel later understood that his sentence repeated the accusation that had injured Frank for years, that Sarah might have chosen absence. Frank died in 1996 after a second heart. His wallet contained Sarah's school photograph. At the funeral, Evelyn placed an empty chair beside the front row. She said it was not for Sarah. It was for the answer Frank had been denied. Sarah learned of his death 4 years later. In 2000, Sarah used a public library computer, while Silas attended a repair job. Internet access was slow, and local newspaper archives were incomplete. A remain the ald trestewef no long, en a tal as Fogard sent to a perfas Sweetkloof in St. Alder. A memorial article for Frank appeared in a scanned genealogy page. It described him as the father of missing teenager Sarah Newton. Sarah read the paragraph until the librarian asked whether she needed help. She printed the page and hid it inside her coat. That night, she sat in the bathroom and cried without making a sound. Frank had died, believing she was gone. The threat that originally kept her silent had outlived one of the people she intended to protect. Sarah searched again months later and found that Evelyn had moved to Baton Rouge with Daniel. She wrote down the address. She did not send a letter. At that point, silence was no longer maintained only by Silas. It was maintained by the weight of 21 years. Sarah imagined calling her mother and explaining that she had lived in houses, worked in motels, raised a child, and passed through public spaces while the family searched. She understood the reasons. She also understood how they might sound. Silas had committed the crime. Sarah still felt responsible for every year after the first chance to speak. Trauma did not obey the simple boundary between what a person could have done and what outsiders believed a person should have done. Silas suffered a stroke in 2002 while repairing a supermarket refrigeration unit. He died 2 days later at a hospital in Spokane. The death certificate identified him as Samuel Crane. Sarah was 40. For the first time since 1979, no living person controlled whether she could walk out the front door. Marlene called from Arkansas and instructed Sarah to destroy the metal cash box. Sarah refused. Marlene warned that exposing the false identities would lead to Sarah's arrest and Rebecca's humiliation. She said Louisiana authorities might accuse Sarah of participating in fraud or abandoning her family voluntarily. The threats were no longer backed by Silas's physical violence, but they reached the parts of Sarah he had trained for decades. Sarah kept the identity, Anne Crane. She told Rebecca her father had hidden debts and that they needed to move. They relocated to a small town north of Spokane. Sarah found work in the records department of an assisted living facility. She never remarried. She lived quietly enough that no one searched beyond the documents she provided. She was free in the legal sense, only if no one asked who she had been before Anne. Evelyn lived another 6 years after Frank. She kept Sarah's room largely unchanged until moving to Baton Rouge. Before leaving St. Alder, she packed the blue sweater, nursing books, photographs, and kitchen radio into labeled boxes. Daniel asked why she kept a radio that no longer worked. Evelyn said, because she touched it every morning. Her health declined after a series of small strokes. During the final year, she sometimes confused Daniel with Frank and asked whether search volunteers needed food. On clear days, she remained precise. She asked Daniel to promise that Sarah's case would not be closed after her death. Then she asked a more difficult question. If she left because she wanted to, will you still bring her home? Daniel said yes. Evelyn died in 2008. Sarah discovered the obituary online. Months later, she printed it and placed it beside Frank's. Both parents were gone. The danger Silas used to control her no longer existed in the form he had described. Still, Sarah did not contact Daniel. She later struggled to explain that decision, without sounding as though she had chosen it freely. After nearly 3 decades, calling him would not have meant returning to a familiar family. It would have meant destroying Anne, telling Rebecca that her father was an abductor, exposing forged records, and entering an investigation Sarah could not control. Fear had become routine. Routine had become identity. Identity had become the structure supporting her daughter's life. Sarah understood that silence was harming Daniel. She continued it anyway. That truth remained alongside the truth that she had been kidnapped. Daniel became an industrial electrician like his father. He married a teacher named Laura and had 1 daughter, Emily. He did not build his life around Sarah's case, but the case occupied a permanent room inside it. When the St. Alder Sheriff's Office moved to a new building in 2010, an employee called to ask whether the family wanted copies of old materials. Daniel arrived with empty boxes. He found the original Fair photograph, the broken earring, the mobile telephone report, and the returned letter addressed to Alan Marsh. He also found a Carnival payroll sheet listing a mechanic with that name and a handwritten note from Frank. Worker called him Silas. No investigator had resolved the difference. Daniel began searching public records online. Alan Marsh produced hundreds of results. Silas connected to fewer. He found a Silas Mercer, born in Arkansas in 1945, and a sister named Marlene. He found no recent address for Silas, but discovered that Marlene once owned a red and white Ford pickup. The registration period included 1979. Daniel delivered the information to Detective Mara Dupre, who had recently been assigned to review unresolved parish cases. Dupre was cautious. A vehicle registration did not prove the truck had been in Louisiana. The Carnival photograph did not clearly show the man's face. Witness memories had degraded, but the combination justified renewed work. Dupre located the 1974 Texas report involving Silas under the alias Alan Marsh. For the first time, Sarah's case had a suspect who was not Paul Fontenot. Silas appeared to have died under another name in Washington in 2002. The death ended the possibility of questioning him. It did not end the search for Sarah. In 2012, Daniel provided a DNA sample for the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. A sample from one of Sarah's childhood hairbrushes was too degraded to create a full profile, but technicians preserved it. Daniel's profile was compared with unidentified remains across the country. Several possible matches were investigated and excluded. Each exclusion produced the familiar combination of relief and exhaustion. By 2018, forensic genealogy was changing old cases. Investigators could compare voluntarily uploaded consumer DNA profiles with relatives who might not appear in criminal databases. Emily Newton, Daniel's daughter, submitted a sample to a commercial ancestry service. She also permitted matching for law enforcement-supported missing person research. Daniel disliked the privacy implications. Emily told him that privacy had protected the person who took Sarah longer than it protected their family. For nearly 2 years, no useful match appeared. Then, in April 2020, Emily received a notification identifying a close genetic relative named Rebecca Crane. The relationship was not distant. The service estimated that Rebecca could be Emily's aunt, half-sister, niece, or grandparent-level relative. Rebecca was 35. Her public family tree listed no Newtons and no Louisiana connections. Her mother was Anne Crane, born in Arkansas in 1958. The birth record supporting Anne's identity contained irregularities. The certificate had been created years after the supposed birth. The original child associated with the record had died in infancy. Detective Dupre read the report twice. Then she asked Daniel whether Sarah might have had a child. Daniel answered that Sarah had been 17. The detective said that did not answer the question. Rebecca had taken the DNA test because of a medical concern. Her daughter had been diagnosed with a heart rhythm disorder, and doctors asked for family history. Rebecca knew almost nothing about her father, Samuel Crane, and even less about her mother's relatives. Anne always said the family had died before Rebecca was born. When Emily contacted her, Rebecca initially assumed the match resulted from an adoption or unknown affair. They exchanged basic information. Emily sent a photograph of Sarah from 1979. Rebecca opened it on her phone while sitting beside her mother. Anne saw the image and dropped a glass. She asked where Rebecca had found it. Rebecca said the girl was named Sarah Newton and had disappeared in Louisiana. Anne left the room. She locked herself in the bathroom and remained there for more than an hour. That reaction provided no legal proof. It told Rebecca that her mother recognized the face. When Anne emerged, she said the photograph resembled someone she once knew. Rebecca asked whether Anne was Sarah. Her mother denied it. The denial lasted 4 days. Then Anne placed a metal cash box on the kitchen table. Inside were a silver ring, a small wooden cross, newspaper clippings, and a brass earring without its pair. Rebecca understood that the DNA match had not discovered a distant family secret. It had discovered her mother. Rebecca contacted Emily first. She said, "I think my mother is your Sarah." Daniel was 63 when his daughter repeated those words. He had imagined police calling to identify remains. He had imagined a confession, a grave, or a document proving Sarah left voluntarily. He had not imagined a stranger saying that his sister was alive in Washington. Daniel did not celebrate. He asked for proof. Detective Dupre coordinated with law enforcement in Spokane. Officers approached Anne carefully because the available evidence suggested she may have survived long-term coercion. During the first interview, Anne gave her name as Sarah Elizabeth Newton. She described the kitchen radio, the greenhouse accident that scarred her wrist, Daniel's model airplane, and the caramel apple she promised to bring home. She showed investigators the bent finger Silas broke after the telephone call. A laboratory compared her DNA with Daniel's. The result established a full sibling relationship with overwhelming statistical certainty. On May 18, 2020, the Louisiana missing person record for Sarah Newton was updated. She was no longer classified as missing. She was alive. The phrase appeared miraculous in headlines. The reality inside Daniel's house was more difficult. He sat at the kitchen table with the old radio in front of him and cried for the sister he had found and the family members who had not lived long enough to know. Daniel and Sarah spoke by video call before meeting in person. For several seconds, neither knew what to say. Sarah was 58. Her hair had grayed, and her face resembled Evelyn's more than Daniel expected. Daniel asked whether she remembered him. Sarah said, "You hated raisins, and you hid them under your plate." He laughed once, and then covered his face. Sarah apologized. Daniel asked why. She began describing Silas, Marlene, the photographs of his school, and the threats against their parents. Daniel understood the first years. Then he asked about 2002, after Silas died. Sarah became silent. She said she had been afraid of losing Rebecca and of being prosecuted under the false identity. Daniel asked why. She did not send one anonymous message saying she was alive. Sarah said, "Because every year made the next year harder." He answered that every year had also made Evelyn older. Neither statement canceled the other. Their reunion began with love and accusation occupying the same conversation. That remained true long after cameras stopped reporting the case. Investigators searched records connected to Silas and Marlene. The Nacogdoches property still existed, though the trailer had been removed. A ground search uncovered old electrical cable, a burned clothing fastener, and fragments of plywood beneath the former structure. None could be conclusively tied to Sarah after 4 decades. More useful evidence came from Marlene's Arkansas home. She was 82 and living in a nursing facility after a stroke. A warrant allowed detectives to search stored documents. They found copies of Anne Crane's delayed birth certificate, forged affidavits, carnival payroll records, and photographs of the Newton house. A notebook listed Sarah's family members and routines. Beside Daniel's name, Marlene had written, "School 310." The note confirmed that the threats were planned before the abduction. Marlene was interviewed in the care facility. She admitted helping Silas create documents, but claimed she believed Sarah had run away from an abusive family. Sarah's locked room, injuries, and repeated escape attempts contradicted that claim. Prosecutors charged Marlene with kidnapping, conspiracy, document fraud, and obstruction. Her attorneys argued that dementia made her incompetent to stand trial. Medical evaluations agreed. Marlene died the following year without facing a jury. Silas had already died under a false name. The 2 people responsible for Sarah's captivity escaped meaningful punishment. DNA solved the question of survival. It arrived too late for justice. Detective Dupre located Paul in Mississippi. He was 60 and had spent most of his life avoiding discussion of Sarah. The suspicion attached to him in 1979 followed him through jobs and relationships. He had married once, divorced, and never returned permanently to St. Alder. When told Sarah was alive, Paul sat quietly. His first question was whether she had gone willingly. Dupre said no. Paul lowered his head. For 41 years, he had lived with two fears: that Sarah was dead because he left her alone after an argument, or that she had chosen a life in which he did not exist. Both were wrong. Sarah later spoke with him by telephone. Paul apologized for their final argument. Sarah told him the argument did not cause the abduction. Silas had selected her before that night. Paul said the town had treated him as a murderer. Sarah said she was sorry. The apology sounded inadequate because it was offered by someone who had also been victimized. They did not attempt to rebuild a relationship. Their connection belonged to teenagers who no longer existed. The DNA results also confirmed that Silas Mercer was Rebecca's biological father. Investigators used a sample retained from a medical procedure performed before his death and compared it with Rebecca's profile. Rebecca had known him as a severe, distant parent. She now learned that she had been conceived within the captivity of a kidnapped teenager. The discovery changed every childhood memory. Photographs she once considered family pictures became evidence of control. Birthdays, addresses, and school forms were tied to false identities. Rebecca struggled with guilt, even though she had committed no wrong. She asked Sarah whether her birth had made escape impossible. Sarah answered that Rebecca had given her a reason to survive. Both statements could be true. The child had been used as leverage, and the child had also preserved the mother's will to live. Rebecca stopped using the surname Crane, but did not adopt Newton immediately. She said, "A DNA result could identify relatives, but it could not decide which history belonged to her." Sarah traveled to Louisiana in the fall of 2020. Daniel met her at the airport. Their first embrace was careful. They were siblings by blood and strangers by experience. Sarah visited the Newton house, now owned by another family. The pecan trees remained. The drainage ditch had been replaced by a concrete channel. She did not enter the house. Daniel brought the radio outside. Sarah recognized a scratch near the dial that she had made with a kitchen knife while trying to repair it. She turned the knob. Nothing happened. The moment did not restore childhood. It confirmed how much time had passed. At the cemetery, Sarah stood between Frank and Evelyn's graves. Their stone included a small inscription added during the years she was missing: "Waiting for our daughter." Sarah knelt and placed the wooden cross Daniel carved against the marker. She apologized aloud. Daniel remained several yards away. He later said he did not know whether the apology belonged to their parents, to him, or to Sarah herself. There was no answer from the graves. The locked room was visible captivity. The documents created a second form that followed her after doors were opened. Silas persuaded her that Sarah Newton existed only as a missing girl in newspapers, while Anne Crane was the person recognized by employers, hospitals, schools, and the government. 41 years later, DNA reversed that claim. It proved that paperwork could be false, even when it had shaped an entire life. The official investigation concluded that Silas Mercer abducted Sarah from the St. Alder Parish Fair with Marlene's assistance. The storm, power outage, open service gate, and failed employee records allowed him to leave Louisiana before authorities treated the case as an abduction. Paul Fontenay's argument with Sarah distracted investigators. The red and white pickup, carnival photograph, broken earring, and false name were all present in the original file. They had never been assembled into one explanation. DNA did what the paper investigation failed to do. It connected Rebecca to the Newton family and forced the identity Anne Crane to be examined. But DNA could not establish every assault, threat, movement, and decision made during captivity. It could not prosecute a dead man. It could not make an incompetent accomplice stand trial. It could not return Frank and Evelyn to their daughter. It could not repair Paul's reputation or give Daniel the adolescence he spent watching the telephone. And it could not tell Sarah how to live as herself after spending most of her life under another name. Daniel and Sarah remained in contact, but their relationship was not the easy reunion described in early news reports. Daniel sometimes became angry when Sarah avoided questions about the years after Silas died. Sarah sometimes felt that every family conversation became an examination of why she had failed to return. She wanted him to understand coercive control. He wanted her to understand the suffering created by silence. Both needs were legitimate. Neither could be fully satisfied by the other. Sarah returned to Washington after 3 weeks. She legally changed her name to Sarah Ann Newton. She kept Anne because it represented the woman who raised Rebecca and survived when Sarah was not safe to exist. She declined most interviews. When a reporter asked whether she was happy to be found, Sarah said the question assumed being found happened in one moment. "I'm still finding out what was taken," she said. Sarah Newton did not run away from Louisiana in 1979. She did not leave because of an argument with Paul, fear of college, or conflict with her father. Silas Mercer studied her routine, learned about her family, and used her desire to become a nurse to lure her behind the maintenance trailers. He abducted her during a storm and transported her to Texas. Marlene Mercer helped confine her, create false documents, and threaten the people Sarah loved. Silas moved her across several states and controlled her through violence, isolation, forged identity papers, and threats against her family and daughter. Sarah survived. Survival did not look like a continuous escape attempt. Sometimes it looked like cooperation, silence, work, motherhood, and the performance of a life she had not chosen. After Silas died, the physical captivity ended. The identity he created remained. Sarah stayed hidden because fear had become part of how she understood safety, and because returning required her to expose Rebecca, confront legal uncertainty, and explain decades no explanation could restore. In 2020, Rebecca's DNA matched Sarah's niece Emily. The match led investigators to Anne Crane, the woman who possessed Sarah's ring, scar, memories, and genetic connection to Daniel Newton. 41 years after the parish fair, Sarah was removed from the missing person database. The Louisiana cold case was solved, but the solution did not produce the ending her parents imagined. Frank and Evelyn were dead. Silas was beyond prosecution. Marlene died before trial. Daniel found an older sister who remembered him, but had lived an entire lifetime without him. Sarah found a family that loved her and also carried questions she could not answer without reopening the worst years of her life. The DNA result proved that Sarah Newton was alive. It could not prove that survival was the same as being saved. In the Newton kitchen, the radio had remained silent for 41 years. When Daniel finally placed it in Sarah's hands, she turned the dial and heard nothing. She smiled at the broken machine, then began singing the wrong words to a song neither of them had heard since childhood. Daniel corrected her automatically. For a few seconds, they laughed. Then the moment passed. The parents who once listened from the hallway were gone. The house belonged to strangers. The girl who promised a caramel apple had become a woman shaped by another name. What returned was not the past, it was the truth. And truth, arriving 41 years late, could identify what had been stolen without giving any of it back.